It's fantastic to see so many parents, caregivers, and community professionals joining together to hear Dr. Michael Ungar and learn more about how we can support children and youth in our communities, especially in light of what we've endured as a result of COVID-19. I'm particularly pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Ungar, as I've had the opportunity to learn from him as a professor at Dalhousie, as well as a mentor in his social ecological approach mentorship program that Huron-Perth communities were able to provide some of us this year. So without further ado, Dr. Michael Ungar is a key resource to our work with children and youth and families in Huron-Perth County. He's the founder and the director of the Resilience Research Institute at Dalhousie University. His groundbreaking work as a family therapist and resilience researcher is recognized around the world, with much of that work focused on the resilience and marginalized children and families and adult populations experiencing mental health challenges at home and in the workplace. Dr. Ungar has provided consultation and training to Fortune 500 companies such as Save the Children and the Red Cross, as well as educational institutions and government agencies on 5 continents. He is routinely called upon by thought leaders such as the Boston Consulting Group and Canvas 8. His work emphasizes how to use the theory of resilience to increase both individual and institutional agility during crises, with numerous organizations having adopted his concept of resilience as a negotiated process and enhances well-being and social responsibility. So without further ado, I will pass it to Dr. Michael Ungar for tonight's presentation.
Well, a huge thank you to the whole team who put this together. It has been an interesting journey since about 2014, as Val mentioned, and working with Dana and former director of HPC, Terry Sparling, and indeed the school boards and the whole region. I've been there many times and been impressed by what the community's commitment to pull together and to, in a sense, create systemic change for children and families. And I think that's what keeps drawing me back. And it was really interesting too, just to sort of give you some context to this. I've had a chance to work with many of the clinicians in the school boards and the Huron-Perth Center and other allied professionals on really beginning to think or change, or add to, not really change, but add to the scope of practice and to introduce a more, well, contextual or ecological idea of what resilience means. Trying to get us to pay attention to some of the context, and that's been a really interesting message. And I've got to honestly tell you folks, as much as it's been me coming in and saying, you know, sharing a model, the traffic of ideas has been on both ways on this one, and I've been learning a lot from my colleagues there about what actually works for families in crisis, experiencing trauma, and how people get through crisis. So what I'm going to do here this evening is be a little bit of a traveling troubadour and share stories from other families that I've encountered. And while we don't have a lot of information on how people actually come back from pandemics, this is kind of a once in 100-year kind of event. We do know from other kinds of events how children and families do recover, and that's the kind of information I'd like to give you here. First of all, I just want to check my sound because I'm talking from Halifax. Everything okay? I'll take it somebody will jump in if my sound drops or something like that. Perfect. We're good. All right. So let me just start with a little bit of a story. It's not a pandemic story, but let me just give you some sense of how I think about resilience. So a while back, when I actually saw people face to face, I was working with a family that had the experience of basically a mom and had a daughter, and it was about this time of year, and the daughter wanted to go out some evening and go to a beach party. Now you're in Ontario, some of you might have beaches nearby, you might have forests, or you know it as tailgate parties or whatever, that kind of thing, right? Unsupervised, bunch of kids, you know the score. Anyways, this mom was sort of really wrestling with this. She knew how dangerous this could be to her daughter. So she kind of said to her daughter, no, you cannot go to such an event. It's just not going to happen. It's too risky. You're 14 years old, not going to happen. And she said, well, look, why don't you just have a bunch of your girlfriends come over and they can spend the night and be in the basement and order pizza and watch movies and stay up as late as you want, and I will never come down and all that kind of stuff. Anyways, the daughter basically, sort of rolled her eyes at her mom and said, oh, that is so lame. And she ran away that evening and ended up at the beach party or wherever she kind of ended up. And, there was a lot of risky behaviors there. So not a great solution to that by setting, sort of just saying, no, you can't do that. And instead offering the child this opportunity to have friends over in the basement sort of thing. A few months later, I encountered another family with a daughter almost the same age. And this mom had a kind of also wish that her daughter would not go to the beach party. So basically what happened was that she says to her daughter, no, I totally get it. I used to go to beach parties, but I don't think it's a safe thing for you to do. I'd like you to not go there. In fact, I'm going to insist that you don't go there. But, and this was the key, she says to her daughter, I understand what you're trying to do here. You're trying to be older. You're trying to, I see you want something here. So when you're 16, we can renegotiate this about the beach parties. But in the meantime, what about this? What if I pack up the car and took you and some of your friends to that really big concert that you'd like to go to, one of those outdoor concerts, with 80,000 people, whatever. And I'll drive you there. I'll pay for half your ticket. You have to be responsible enough to raise the other half of the ticket price. You can bring some friends, and I won't even go into that venue. You can go in and do everything that you particularly want to do. So basically, mom was going to come in, but not kind of compete. Okay. Anyways, the long and the short of it is, mom drives them 3 hours to this concert venue in Moncton. We're in Halifax. Parks herself at a Tim Hortons for 12 hours and lets her daughter go in with her friends and have this amazing experience in which she feels older and in more control of her life and everything else. Quite a story. And what a vote of confidence to mom that she sort of did that. Now, the reason I'm sharing that story is because we're at a critical moment here. We're at a critical moment of wanting our children to come back stronger. We want them to we want them to come out of their homes, re-engage at school, make new connections, and feel confident doing that. And I guess when I think about the resilience that our kids are going to need, I'm kind of going to shift the focus away from just their own cognitions, their own ways of thinking, to saying that I think we have a role as their families and as their parents in creating an environment around them that gives them what they need, the supports they need, helps them to transition. So if you think about that mom, the second mom, she recognized that her daughter was looking to be older, looking to feel more mature, to take some responsibility. So what she provided was a facilitative environment. And if we want our children to come back stronger and even maybe come back better, then part of that storyline is going to be how we, if I can use the title of the book here, show our love for them, but also change the world around our kids to make it possible for them to survive and thrive. Now, just before I go on, I just want to check. And I just want to say, so it sounds like everything's great. I just want to check. I saw a bunch of flare. I just want to make sure the sound and everything is really good. Welcome to the Zoom world, right? Let me just kind of bring the story a little bit forward here, where let's change it from just a kind of the normal raising kid kind of story to what we actually know about kids living in more difficult environments. This is a picture from outside of Angkor Wat, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site in Cambodia. And I took this picture a few years back when I was traveling there, and that little girl is probably about maybe 11 years old, and obviously she has responsibility for a younger sibling there. And when you go through Asia and other countries around the world, other parts of the world, you often see a scene like this where a child actually has a genuine responsibility for another child. Her parents are probably inside the World Heritage Site as selling goods or tour guides or whatever else. Anyways, if you were to ask this girl about her life, she would certainly say she wished she could go off and play and not have the responsibilities for the younger ones. But you'd also hear a story of how she feels like her contribution to her family is really important. She likes, in some regards, that her resilience is tied up with the sense of making a genuine contribution to help others. So sometimes when people come to me, I learn from kids like this kid is living in quite difficult circumstances, in poverty, in a very sort of, an area that maybe she's under-resourced, maybe she doesn't have access to school. I mean, this is not the kind of situation that most of your children are living in. But what it does teach us a little bit is some of the clues to what children are actually looking for from us if they're going to overcome a difficult life circumstance, like potentially a pandemic. So here I've given you two different contrasting examples. A 14-year-old who wants to go to a beach party and ends up going to a concert instead. And here's a kid who has genuine responsibilities for a sibling and actually uses that experience to feel good and more mature and connected to her community and her family. So this becomes a little bit, if you will, I'm developing a bit of a script here for you. I'm beginning to hint that maybe our children need certain things that we provide them as their communities, their families, and their schools. And if I might, I know that sometimes we want to focus on our child. If I ask most people, in fact, I was just on something where a whole global community was online and we were chatting. I said, what's resilience? And people said, oh, the ability to overcome, or someone said, it's like I felt like I went through a storm and came out the other side unscathed. And I went, yes, but did you have like that's all focused on you as an individual being super rugged. And in a way, when we talk about rugged individuals, your kids as being rugged, it's a great idea. And yes, that is part of their resilience, but it tends to speak to kids who have fewer problems, because when you have a lot of problems, you also need resources. You need a raincoat, you need a map, you need a shelter, you need a government who puts in safe roads to travel, a transportation system, a house over your head, heat, etc., etc. So what we're beginning to understand is while it's great to think of our kids being rugged, it's part of our role to also make sure they're resourced. And in fact, during normal times, for most of our children, the stress they experience is sort of in proportion to the amount of challenges or resources that they have. We have parents who look after us. As we mature, they give us kind of what we need. Like that girl wanted to go to the concert. She had normal boundaries set on her, that type of thing. And of course, during a crisis, whether that's simply that we're maturing and changing or maybe, whatever, we can get out of whack. Suddenly we don't have everything we need. And we begin to ask of our environment, our parents, our community, our family, our schools for more resources. We need a little bit of extra help. And of course, the problem with the pandemic is that we loaded our kids with stressors. Oh my God, worries about medical things, financial crises inside families, the stress of learning online, all their activities ended, boredom, anxiety about what's going to happen if they're in grade 12. It was all this worry about, am I going to be able to go on to college, university, et cetera, et cetera. And at the same time, we took away all the resources from them as well. They couldn't gather with their friends and form new relationships or even have prom nights and all those other things, which we used to sort of buffer them against the stressors in their lives. So this is, in a sense, what we're seeing with our kids. And no surprise, like I was just part of a scientific lead on a study in the US where, we looked at thousands of parents and their children. And what we actually found was that, when we talk about resilience or capacity to cope, the younger children were, the more they were likely to be coping quite well with this. Because you think about their lives haven't changed that much, right? They're at home. Okay, maybe they don't go to kindergarten or something, but like they're kind of like, their lives didn't change. They weren't migrating around the community on their own, right? Most of their activities were home-based anyways. But boy, it was young adults who were experiencing that real whammy of anxiety and depression so much of their lives. And I myself have 5 children, and my youngest is 17, just turned 18, and going through that whole sort of graduating from high school and that whole sort of complexity of saying, no prom, no graduation ceremonies, anxiety about what's going to happen next year in terms of going off to university and college. I mean, that generation, that little group in the middle, are experiencing a lot of stress as a consequence of the changes that they've had to experience. So if that's the sort of the problem, then we begin to say, well, what exactly is resilience then? And our resilience is, in a sense, it's our ability to navigate to the resources that we need to do well, our psychological supports, the social connections, our sense of our culture, even the physical resources, whether that's transportation or just health, to be able to do well when we're under stress. but it's also about being able to negotiate or ask for resources to be given to us in ways that frankly make sense to us. So, if you think about during this pandemic, here's a little bit of a weird truth. I mean, for about 90% of kids, we're estimating, they haven't been able to navigate. They haven't been able to find their way. I mean, kind of highlight that word. They haven't been able to find their way to the things that they need to feel good. They don't have their sports activities, their concerts that they would go to, the social connections, the flirting with someone else, all of that stuff is sort of evaporated. So they couldn't even make their way or navigate their way to the sources of support that they needed to do well. But what's worse is they weren't even able to, in a sense, negotiate or ask for other things to substitute for these. I met many kids who said, if I can't go there, could I do this? And even that kind of began to break down for them. So what I've been encountering is kids shutting themselves off, withdrawing from social connections, probably spending way too much time on screens and this type of thing. So their resilience is in a sense tied up to whether or not they find inside their homes substitute ways of feeling good about themselves, of finding the social connections. And this again brings us as adults into their life. Now I'm going to get kind of concrete on this in a few minutes, but if you can kind of hold in your mind these two ideas of helping our children navigate and helping our children negotiate. So let me just give you a little teaser of that. So if I'm thinking during the pandemic, my child has lost their opportunities to play sports or enter or play in the band or something like that, what I'm really talking about is that I've stripped away from them the opportunity to feel powerful, to make decisions, to like who they are, to look out in the world and receive applause. Now, if you're thinking about us as parents, how do we give a child those opportunities to feel a little bit like that? And if I can take a page from that girl in Cambodia, one of the things I've noticed is that families, and there's some evidence of this as well, families who have turned to their children and been a little bit more transparent, we are struggling. There is some problems. We are worried. Financially, we're under more stress. When families were able to say that to their children, we have evidence that children felt like they were being treated more adult-like, like they were part of their families, that they actually felt better about themselves. We also found that families who downloaded responsibilities onto the kids. So I live in the Maritimes, and I often jokingly say we're casserole people. We the family down the street, a child has leukemia, they get a whole freezer full of casseroles. We just swap casseroles back and forth up and down the street. But during the pandemic, I've noticed that families that were really understanding how to help their kids through this period of indecision and dysfunction and danger, what they were insisting is that their kids help make those casseroles. And that their kid, even though if they're, the 10-year-old who's complaining, I don't really want to go down and deliver that to Mrs. Smith down the street, was, forced to take that casserole, which hopefully they had actually helped to make, down the street. And yes, Mrs. Smith is probably going to talk. She's like 88 years old, and she's going to talk to that 10-year-old for about 90 minutes and tell that kid stories. And that kid's going to have to, oh my gosh, they're going to have to just stay there. But my point is as much as that 10-year-old will grumble about having to do it, what we actually know from my science, my clinical practice, is that kid is going to on some level come back home later and know that they made a difference, that they were needed in their community, that they felt like they belonged, that they did a good deed, that they actually, even if it was tough, they made Mrs. Smith feel better. They shone from it. And what's more is they were noticed. We always talk about all these positive things like self-esteem and a sense of optimism for the future and a sense of connection and attachments and engagement. We use those words like, just motherhood and apple pie. We just throw those concepts around, but they don't happen on their own. They happen when we actually help kids navigate to these experiences that are meaningful to them. And that becomes our role. Because if I might, every child has potential, and I know that because I love fairy tales. And a story like Jack and the Beanstalk has a lot to teach us about resilience, but maybe not in the way that you might be thinking. You see, the story of Jack and the Beanstalk, of course, is this kid, and if you think about it, he's described as a dunce. He probably has undiagnosed learning challenges, right? He's living in incredible poverty. His mother's asked this kid who's kind of probably rather impulsively disordered, bad problem solving, to take the cow to market and sell it and bring home the only money that the family needs to basically eat. Otherwise, they're going to die of starvation. An awful kingdom that they live in. There's no social safety net, whatever. Anyways, the kid goes down the street. The con man says, I'll swap you 3 magic beans for the cow. You know how the story goes. Kid gets home. Mom is really upset, throws the beans out the window, sends him to bed without his dinner. Where are the social workers, by the way? You can't send a kid to bed without his dinner. Anyways, next morning, beanstalk is growing up outside the window, and Jack, being this rather impulsively disordered child with learning challenges, whatever, just climbs up the beanstalk. No, not a helmet or any kind of harness, no safety gear or anything. Goes up and steals the golden egg from that giant. Rescues his family out of poverty. Wow. So in this case, what a story. We have a kid who goes up, he steals things. He goes up a second time, he steals the hen that laid the golden egg, and then he goes up and steals the harp that sings itself from that giant. And that giant gets really pissed and kind of chases Jack out of his little garden and tries to chase him down the beanstalk. And Jack, who thankfully was never wasting his time going to school, oh my gosh, what an absolute waste for a child like Jack to go to school, because Jack is down there picking up an axe, and because he spent his whole life on the farm and not wasting his time being some stupid geeky academic kid like me when I was growing up, I would have basically been eaten by the giant. This kid basically picks up an axe and quickly chops down the beanstalk and murders that poor innocent giant. And we celebrate this. We love a story, and Jack is resilient, and he brings his family out of poverty and saves the day from the giant and everything else. Well, hold on a minute here. The point here is the story is that Jack found the perfect fit between the talents he has and an opportunity to use them. So when we're beginning to think about inviting our children to be more resilient, inviting them back into the world, inviting them back into our schools, let me ask us, are we creating opportunities? Are kids just coming back and passively receiving? Or are we going to ask of them something? Are we going to begin to do what we know has cushioned children from the impact of war and other major traumas? After World War II, there was not mass trauma amongst children. Why? Because during the war, most kids understood that their sacrifices, their discomfort, was part of a bigger good, a necessary sacrifice. And I can't help but think that, if we move kids away from the selfishness and begin to emphasize with them that your suffering has meaning, you are making a contribution, you are needed in some real way. And if you begin to think about those things, if we can convey that either through chores, looking after a sibling, looking after a pet, being needed, or that their marks, that their success at school means something to the family, anything we can do to emphasize that the child who makes a contribution and is needed for their specific talents, even if it is climbing beanstalks without safety gear and stealing things and having the brawny muscles to chop down a beanstalk, whatever their talents, that those talents are needed and necessary. When we create those kinds of conditions at our schools or communities and in our families, we know the science of resilience is pretty clear. Those are the children who are able to withstand stressful situations better. So next time you're about to bake a batch of cookies, ask yourself, who should be baking these cookies? My 8-year-old or me? And the answer really should be my 8-year-old, because that batch of cookies is their signal that they have something to contribute to the family. Now, I know this because, I can actually take you to a school example. I know some of you are educators here this evening and stuff. Let me just tell you very quickly, these videos are online and they're all free access, and this book called What Works is also available for free online and stuff. But I've been traveling around the world talking to people who run programs that develop resilience, and there's patterns in that. I thought you'd enjoy this one little example of a school in southern England that was failing. It was a small rural school, couple hundred students that had gone down to 100 students because the parents had perceived that they would send their kids to the bigger school 20 kilometers away. Anyways, this new principal arrives and says, I'm going to reinvigorate this school. And what he does is, a guy named Paul Baker, what he does is he basically plows up part of the playground in August before school starts and begins to install animal pens and then integrates animals into the curriculum of the school. And what he was trying to do was he wanted in an agricultural community to make school more relevant to these children and their families by introducing the animals and agribusiness concepts and other things. In other words, he was trying to basically help these kids rather than them going up, on a bus 20 kilometers to another school. He didn't want, he knew that when a community loses its elementary school, it disintegrates, it loses its heart in a sense. So he wanted to reinvigorate, and he did it by, in a sense, negotiating, saying, what would this community find meaningful? So he said their school's in a crisis, the community's in a bit of a crisis because their school's about to be closed if it drops below 100 students. And he comes in and he says, what's meaningful to these people in this context? And he introduces animals. But no more than that, he introduces a way that vulnerable kids in that school can actually feel important. And this becomes a part of my story about how do we engage children? We make them feel valued, wanted. So here's just one of many examples I've encountered in the world of schools that have successfully engaged children. See what you think.
So in terms of the population, the school, Goulville School, sits in a deprived, quite a deprived area. Nationally as well as within Europe. The project is, it's about supporting and developing the emotional resilience of our pupils and their well-being and staff well-being as well. And it's centered around animals, the use of animals and therapeutic care.
So can you give some examples of what the program actually looks like that's sort of different than your regular educational institution?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so what does it look like on the ground? So if you walked around the school, there is a paddock with 2 Pygmy goats called Frodo and Bilbo. They're recent additions to the school in the last 8 months actually now. Further on, there's a chicken enclosure, quite a large chicken enclosure, and rabbits as well. And the latest addition from September 2017 is a dog called Whoopi. So a school dog, again, pure, in terms of building relationship and self-esteem. That's what they're for. And they've at Goulville, they've become part of what they call what we know as the school family. So they're no different to any of the pupils, parents, community. They're very much part of the community there.
You can watch the full video online if you search for that What Works and Goulville School, you'll find it. But what's a lovely example there of that, he kind of thought about what is needed by this particular group of the children in this particular school and these families as well. What would be meaningful to them? And I think when you get that, in fact, and I love the fact that with Whoopi the dog, he actually assigns the children who are the most vulnerable the responsibility of walking the dog, because as he says, they'll come, children who won't come to school necessarily on their own will come the day that they're assigned to walk the dog, because it has a certain higher status. It has a certain cachet. Other kids look up to them. Wow, you got to walk the dog today. That's a responsibility. And again, I'm getting at this idea that, if we want our children to engage, it's not an abstract idea. It's a concrete thing that we do by giving them tasks to feel like they actually have something meaningful to contribute. So I guess what I'm really getting at here is that over the last little while, we've been developing this program called R2 Resilience. And what we've been trying to reach for is more of like a curriculum that can integrate into, mental health centers, or indeed we have versions ready for schools, et cetera, et cetera. But what we're talking about, my colleagues and I, is we're talking about building personal rugged qualities of kids. That's really important, but also creating resources or environments around kids that actually help them to become their best selves. Now, there is one trick to this, and I have to introduce the word culture into this conversation, because it's really about what is a resource and what is a rugged quality for a child really kind of depends on what is culturally relevant. So I'm assuming I'm in Halifax, and although we may share some cultural similarities because of where we are and our class, our geography, our nationality, or whatever. But there's also going to be nuances based on our history and indeed our ethnicity, our racial backgrounds, et cetera, et cetera. So when you begin to think about that, you got to think about, okay, what is unique about my family, or what is my collective culture that I'm also going to be sharing with my child that's going to make it relevant to that particular kid that's meaningful. So, you might ask yourself that the girl who wanted to go to the dance, music, a certain kind of experience, a certain kind of being independent at 14 is all within her cultural norms. If she was a child in, I don't know, in China or somewhere, chances are her definition of independence and her sense of being a young woman and what she should be doing would be dictated a lot by the norms around her. So I guess the question you have to ask yourself is, not only how can I help my child become more rugged, and what resources am I going to give my child, or what opportunities, but what is going to be meaningful to them and us in a culturally relevant way. Now, let me make this point in a way that's kind of, again, because we're talking about kids coming back from a disaster, the pandemic. So let me share a story of kids coming back, from a different kind of disaster, which is in this case in northern Japan, when they had that sequence of a major earthquake followed by a major tsunami, and of course the nuclear disaster. And a year or two after the event, I actually was visiting there with a colleague who was doing research in that area, and I was supporting that research at the time. And we went up to one of the towns called Yamata, and this is what it looked like before the tsunami. The tsunami rolled in at 11 meters high, wall of water, and it came in around noon hour. So what happened was that many of the kids were in school and they evacuated because they had tsunami alarms. But many of the parents were living down and working down in the floodplain, and it was actually they that died in larger numbers than the kids. And just a mass destruction, and then fires broke out, and this is the kind of disaster that kids eventually returned to. What they did, though, I want to just explain this for a second. Coming out of a disaster like that, the Japanese government set up housing to get kids sort of housed, ideally with extended family if they were orphaned. They cleared away all the debris to start the reconstruction process. And then the not-for-profit organizations came in and they built things like what you're looking at there. That is not a school. The school buildings were made out of stone and were out of the floodplain, and they actually survived quite well. That is an after-school school. In other words, that's a prep school. And what I learned was that a normal life for a Japanese child is to go to school all day and then in the evenings go and study some more, and on weekends, which I love telling that story to my own children, even though they just roll their eyes when I did. But anyways, what was interesting about this was my colleague, Dr. Keiji Akiyama, showed me several of these schools as part of their trauma-informed way of helping these kids come back from the horrible losses that they'd experienced, or the trauma of watching their community just wiped away. And after about the third of these schools I saw, I said, okay, I get it, Keiji. You're helping kids get back onto an educational pathway in a culturally relevant way, because this is something the kids accept as normal behavior for Japanese children, et cetera, et cetera. But what about like the soccer balls and the right to play and the other activities that kids need to come back from trauma? And Keiji, he looks at me and goes, Mike, why would we want our children wasting their time playing? And that is culture. A set of expectations and values, practices and beliefs that says this is the way a child heals. And in a sense, what you're looking at is a world sort of cocooned around these kids that makes them feel normal, that re-engages them in a normal life. You could sit them in front of a mirror with a psychotherapist. No offense to my colleagues who are psychotherapists. I'm a therapist. I do clinical cognitive work as well, but in isolation, that's not enough. What the kids actually needed also for their resilience was a sense that the school needs them, or that my family needs me to go back to my normal life. You take the kid in that classroom and you say, you know, how do you feel about the future now? They say, I'm on track again towards the future. My optimism is being elevated. If you want a kid to be more hopeful, you don't just tell them to be hopeful. You give them an opportunity to feel like the world is a predictable place that is giving them and rewarding them for their effort that they're putting in. When we create environments rich in those kinds of conditions for our kids, they will show up. They will participate. Not every single kid, but most kids, they will participate. Their anxiety levels will drop. They will feel that the world is predictable and safe again. We want to talk about how do you deal with anxiety and depression and all these things that are going to sort of follow our children through past the pandemic. It's going to have a lot to do with how we create safe, stable routines in their lives. Do we get them back into waking up early in the morning, the routines of eating well, of exercise, of paying attention to the holidays, of connecting with their extended family and their grandparents, et cetera, et cetera. The more we put those things in place, the more we signal to them that they're needed, that life is predictable, and that they can feel secure about the future. For most kids, that will decrease their anxiety and buffer them against depression. These are sort of, some of those kinds of conditions that we know will actually be helpful. So I guess we're talking here about how do we help kids navigate and negotiate for the rugged qualities and the resources they need to do well. Now, this whole R2 approach, rugged and resource, what we've actually been doing is looking at different ways of encouraging these. And I just wanted to go through some this evening, introduce to you some of the strategies that we use to actually help these kids become better and more rugged selves, as well as better resourced. And these are things which you as families and educators and community members can actually do for kids. So let me just kind of run through a little bit of this list here with you. So for instance, motivation. Oh boy. We often talk about a lot of our kids are losing their motivation because of schooling. They've just been worn down by being at home, not active enough, et cetera, et cetera. And now hopefully next year when they come back, we want them to come back better. And that's going to mean motivating them to get reconnected to school. Now, motivation, they talk about an external motivator or an intrinsic motivator, right? I think really positive. I have an attitude towards the future. I'm going to go for it. Or I have an external motivator, right? That someone's going to make me do and be my best self. And the trick, of course, is to make sure that what kind of motivation a child has matches their needs. So, here's just as a small clip from Facing the Giants, the movie. This is one example of motivation, an external motivation. I just want to show you this clip. It's about 30 seconds long here. I think it might be kind of funny here or whatever. Okay, so that's like one kind of motivation. I don't recommend you try that with kids. But anyway, but actually I do recommend you try that with kids. If you're a football coach or a coach or whatever, that is an appropriate way, potentially, I don't know if it is or not, but someone can correct me, to motivate an athlete, a high performance athlete. They expect it. They have agreed to it. It has a context to it. But that's the point of things like motivation. Any word I say when we're talking about resilience is there's always this element of negotiation. Is that the right way to motivate a more kind of gentle child that doesn't like to be yelled at, who just simply needs a little bit of encouragement? No, the way you motivate that child is, you rub them on their head and you say, come on down, I made your favorite breakfast. It's going to be a tough day. I know it's going to be hard to make the changes, but come on, you can do it. And I packed your lunch really nicely. And you know what? I bet you're going to have a nice time with your new friends, and off you go. It's a gentle hug and a kiss and off they go, right? They need that hug and that reassurance, completely different kind of motivation. And the trick, of course, is that for us as their caregivers, we're going to have to motivate kids with what is meaningful to them. So for some children showing back up at our schools, they're going to want that high performance, high energy, raw, lots of activities. And for other children, because it's been so long, they're going to need a little bit more of a gentler landing as they come in. And that is always an element of negotiation in terms of helping kids find what they need to do well. If I might, we also know that our, motivation is about whether, if you can feel like you're contributing. This is a lovely photo of Dr. Simon Demers Marcel in Calgary during the pandemic, and the Associated Press caught this photo when he was just calling up another family to tell them about, I think it was the death of one of their loved ones in the ICU unit due to COVID. And what pushes someone in that situation to, despite the exhaustion and the emotional turmoil of the job, to keep going? Sometimes it is a more intrinsic belief that you can keep pushing. But even then, let's face it, that is generated by a world around you that acknowledges your important contribution. If I keep coming back to that concept of contribution, it's because we know that people survive wars and chaos and tsunamis and wildfires when they feel like their suffering has meaning, when they've actually made a contribution, when they're needed. All things that we as families and schools can actually convey to our children. There's other things, though. There's other sort of ways of making our children a little more rugged. One of the ones, of course, is to help them show gratitude, to spend a little bit of time each day just to say what went well today. Yes, you couldn't see your friends, but was there one moment today that went well? And when they go back to school, if you want to help them come back better, that's also gonna, yes, it was a tough day of transition. Yes, it felt awkward being back in class. Yes, the rules felt, I hated sitting in my seat all day, whatever it is. But to also pause them and say, was there anything good about today? Yes, I saw my friend I hadn't seen in a while, or I liked art class or something. That moment of gratitude, to pause, and even if it's putting a rock in a bowl and seeing the bowl, over the month kind of grow in terms of what's in there, anything that signals that life has something positive is really, really useful. I've already talked about optimism, but let me just mention it again. It's something that we can instill in our children, and indeed all of us. I mean, how many of us are not optimistic before the birth of our first child, and then we become sleepless and tired and everything else? But that's another story. I mean, but optimism is something that's given to people as well as something that's internal. When you create a predictable environment, the child's lunch is the same, or at least is something that they like and is predictably available. There's a routine in their lives. There's a sense that tomorrow is going to be the same as today, at least in terms of the things that make you feel safe and secure. That actually seeds optimism. And I think sometimes we forget that these conditions around us, that we're more optimistic when the world feels predictable and safe, all things that we as children's caregivers create. And indeed, optimistic people tend to take advantage of opportunities. So if you're an optimistic child and then the teacher offers them an opportunity to learn something new, they're much more likely to seize on that because they see it as part of their future. Not to mention, an optimistic child also has a bigger set of relationships, and with bigger sets of relationships, optimistic people usually get better information about things. They learn about opportunities or that type of thing. The only downside of optimism is they gamble more. Optimistic people also gamble more, which kind of is a downside, but nevertheless. Anyways, my point is that we create predictable environments, we get more optimistic kids. Bedtimes, setting the table times, routines around birthdays, all those kinds of things signal to the child the world is a predictable place, and that creates a sense of hopefulness about the future. What about the big three? Oh, nutrition, sleep, physical activity. They can't eat junk food all the time. They do need proper sleep, and gosh darn, they need to be outdoors, hopefully, and getting some exercise. And those three things trigger a series of biological changes, psychological changes, and of course, physiological changes as well. And our children are simply able to withstand stress the more that those three things are part of their life. If all they're eating is, pop and chips and pizza, not sleeping regular hours, and physical activity has gone out the window, you can expect a child who becomes much more dysregulated and really, I can confidently say, much more prone to anxiety and depression long term. So again, these are things that we as parents, in a sense, control. Of course, supportive relationships mean a lot as well, and that starts with us as their caregivers for sure, but it extends well beyond us as well to all kinds of folks that are in our lives, our extended family. I mean, again, if you have a grandparent that hasn't been visited in a while, Is your child part of that phoning up grandma or grandpa? Is your child implicated in doing a piece of artwork and putting it up on the web and showing their grandparents something that they've accomplished? There's a sense of performance here that solidifies and sews those relationships together. And of course, a sense of control. Children need a sense that they're making decisions for themselves. I love blanket forts because one, I have fond memories of them as a kid, but I also like blanket forts because what they do is they signal to kids that this is your space. You have created your own little house. And if you hang a sign on it that says no adults allowed, even better. And if you eat your breakfast in there and you sleep in there, if that's your choice, then all the better. It's like they have a space that they can control. Vice versa is good modeling. If they can control their space, then I can put a blanket on my office door so my kids don't knock when I'm actually presenting, that type of thing, right? So you can imagine that we can model for our kids a sense of control, but kids do need to have some decision-making power, which is why, you know, even a younger child can say which book they want read to them before they go to bed. And yes, if it happens to be the same one that they've read 1,368 times before, then you as the parent just basically have to suffer through that. But the point is, it's that control, right? Is that that's what children thrive on. And it also, we know, makes them more resistant to feeling dysregulated or depressed or anxious and these kinds of things. These are, again, something that we can help them feel by giving them opportunities to have things that they can control. So you can't tell a child to, you know, be in control. You got to create the opportunities in age-appropriate ways for them to be able to control the things that they should be able to make some decision on. So while they can't decide if they're going to have a vegetable in their dinner, they might be able to decide if it's peas or carrots, that type of thing. Children also need a powerful identity. And again, you know, we need all this ability to be a little bit like Jack and the Beanstalk to show what we can do well. And if I might, I just wanted to sort of honor a young woman named Emily Tuck, who was 17 years old. Emily was one of the 22 victims of the mass shooting in April 2020 here in Nova Scotia. And both her and her parents actually were all killed in that shooting. But about a few weeks before the shooting, just as the pandemic began, Nova Scotians did what Nova Scotians do really well, and that was to hold a kitchen party, but in this case, a virtual kitchen party. And Emily, though she wasn't the world's best violinist, fiddler, she gets online and records a little tune and puts it into the Nova Scotia kitchen party. She's basically saying that I might be cut off from my friends and everyone else, but I'm going to put something out there that shows who I am and make my contribution to making the world a little bit better place. And if you think about it, this is what all kids need, even during the pandemic and of course post-pandemic, as we invite them back into their schools. How are kids going to show what they can do? How are we going to give them opportunities to feel powerful and they're needed for their contribution? And this is Emily Tuck doing exactly that.
Okay, so your contribution to the COVID kitchen party.
Herbie McLeod.
Wicked.
All right.
I mean, it's just a testament to the spirit of that sense of, you know, wanting to push through a crisis, in that case, the pandemic. And, you know, it's just a little bit of a way of honoring that, you know, we have things that we can contribute. All children have something that can make others feel good. So, you know, if I might, I believe that there's a sort of a chat function or a Q&A function in this. And, you know, I'd encourage you, just as I sort of continue to talk a little bit here, you might want to share one of your strategies that you've used to make a child more rugged and better resourced during the pandemic. And then maybe at the end of the presentation, I'll just have Val or, you know, someone else is maybe summarize some of those, or you might be able to read them in the Q&A. But I'm curious, like, have you made a child more optimistic? Have you figured out how to give them a sense of contribution? Have you helped them to find ways of connecting with their friends or sharing their powerful identities or feeling in control of their lives? Like, I'm just really curious if you yourselves have any great examples, and if you wouldn't mind just writing them in the Q&A box. What I'm kind of getting at here is, of course, I know sometimes we think about resilience as like, okay, my child is this, and they're going to snap together, and they're going to be more resilient, right? They have that talent to, say, throw a football or play the piano or something, and therefore they're going to need a certain situation to feel good about themselves. But actually, children aren't puzzle pieces. They're more like what's called a tangram, where what they have is all kinds of potential talents and skills and special things about them that can be assembled in multiple different ways depending on the context in which they find themselves. So if you put them into schools in an orderly world, they become squares or rectangles. But gosh darn, you create a pandemic and suddenly they have to adapt to online learning and everything else, and maybe they form themselves into a bird. And the good news is that probably about 10% of our children are actually doing better during the pandemic, or did better during the pandemic, than children before the pandemic. I've estimated that based on some prior research by Anthony Mancini in the US and others who have looked at this kind of positive growth from adversity idea. But the point is that, you know, for some children, let's face it, like dogs, I was going to say dogs too are happier during the pandemic. They're all at home with their owners, right? But children, you know, for some children, not that we should compare children to dogs, that's whatever, but you know, I get the idea. But for children, it's like some found that it was a calmer time. They were less rushing around. The context fitted them. They were a little bit shyer. They didn't have to put up with the bullies at school. Their parents weren't rushing them 3 activities an evening. For some, this may have been a better time. So I guess I'm always sort of really conscious about, you know, as you look at your child, what is it that they need, and how can we create environments which are going to bring out or help them configure those talents together? Now, look, when they come back to school, they've been at home, they've been learning technology, they've maybe mastered other things on the internet, et cetera, Where is all that learning going to be honored? If we're talking about engaging children, are we going to just say, okay, all back to the way it was? That seems to me a waste. How are we going to be more inclusive of the learning that they've actually brought along? And I make sure that part of that adaptation, that growth, that ability to self-regulate, that ability to look after themselves, to self-study, that ability to learn online, all these other things that they've picked up, how do we keep going with those a little bit so we don't throw out some of the good things that also happened as we learned how to educate our children and how to engage our children during this particularly difficult time? What I can tell you is, I know that anxiety is probably going to go up. I mean, that's the bad news story. Anxiety was going up anyways from about 2006 onwards. We knew that anxiety amongst kids and depression amongst our children was increasing at a rapid rate. We expect to see quite a spike in that because of the pandemic as we move into the new year. But the solution is going to be also about whether or not we can create opportunities for them to actually, well, frankly, get back out into nature, right? To feel confident outside, to walk across a log, to be out in nature, to experience things. We also are going to have to encourage them to, with, you know, yes, you can, rather than saying no, you can't, because so much of the past year has been no, you can't go visit, no, you can't touch that. No, someone described kids' lives the last year as like living in a wet paint world. Don't touch anything. It's maybe a little bit like this, right? We've been saying no. I mean, you know, there have been dangers in kids' lives. And indeed, I've learned to say yes to children more than no. And I see the good example of this is, you know, you think these are really dangerous. These are really bad for kids, you know, knock them, thunk them on the head. But kids haven't changed. They still want to, you know, be out there, outgoing and everything else. And so we've been building these kinds of things. So we say yes to a child. They're not as dangerous as that. They're much better. But they appear to sort of do the same thing. So how are we going to structure our classrooms, our families, our opportunities for our kids to have their needs met, to feel all those kinds of adventuresome things that they need? And that becomes our role as parents, to kind of create environments rich in opportunities so kids can feel rugged and, of course, be better resourced. And finally, let me just leave you with one last image. It's this. We're also going to have to let our kids get dirty again. In fact, we're going to have to encourage children to get dirty. That is also going to be part of their resilience. We're going to need them to basically, I'm going to suggest that they, you know, get muddy And if they feel comfortable touching other children, to roll around and touch and hug and, just we're going to have to get our kids comfortable again with being messy so that they aren't fearful of germs. In fact, if anything, what we really want, of course, is when it's post-pandemic, we want our children to be kind of exposed to a lot of germs because that's what creates a healthy immune system. And a healthy immune system lately has been beginning to be understood as linked to emotional well-being as well. There seems to be some connection between a healthy microbiome in our guts, our immune system being robust, and indeed our emotional states as well. And so maybe having kids kiss a cow, roll in mud, even eat their sandwich off the grass if they happen to have dropped it, maybe those things aren't so crazy at a time post-pandemic when we want our children to feel stronger and healthier, safer. All the things that we can do to invite them back into the world to be normal kids again, but not just normal kids again, kids that are actually have integrated what they've learned, but also moved on from this pandemic. And hopefully, as we title tonight's is, hopefully they'll actually come back better and stronger and maybe just a little bit more able to make really good contributions to their communities, their schools, and ultimately their families as well. So on that note, a huge thanks for listening, a huge thanks for the invitation, and I'd love to hear your thoughts and questions.
So just to hear that, so far we don't have that many questions, but we do have a lot of really great comments on how parents or caregivers have been supporting and building resilience for their kids in the last year or so, right? So we've been publishing those in the announcements, but we can kind of run through a few of them if you'd like to beforehand. And then we do have, I see some questions coming in now. So what would you like to, how would you like to move forward, Dr. Ungar?
Well, I'll let people look. People can scroll through the Q&A themselves to see those examples, and I won't be able to read them myself at the moment. But I'll take some questions first, and then we can, just to create. I just wanted to spark people's own imaginations. I figured that if we have parents here, you have great suggestions. I don't want it to only be me making the suggestions. I feel like a traveling troubadour. I'm picking up ideas from other families, but this is great. So if you have some questions, I'd love to, go with that.
Absolutely. So I just wanted to share. First we have lots of great suggestions from parents and caregivers. So definitely check those out for our participants. Lots of creativity and great resources there. And the first question we have up is, how do you motivate the clearly unmotivated child? So those hard to crack nuts, I think.
Well, okay. So when I meet a really unmotivated child, I guess the question is, what is meaningful to that child? And if the parent says nothing is meaningful, okay, well, obviously the child wants something. So is it to play video games all day or whatever? I mean, for instance, could we change even a video game playing kid from, we understand, for instance, the science, and this is becoming real clear, that passively consuming TikTok videos, bad. Actively developing TikTok videos and posting them, being online in an active way, even gaming in an active online community is actually not so bad. Now, as long as we're not talking 8 hours a day, we're talking maybe a few hours a day, right? So the child obviously wants something. If it's gaming, then how are they getting time on their games? Who's buying the gaming system? Who's paying for the internet? I'm just always confused by, there's usually something that the child wants from us as their caregivers, whether it's a nicer pair of jeans or sneakers or a drive to their friends. I just don't, there's usually something that they want from us that we can then, in a sense, get into an exchange with and says, well, I'd like to do that for you, but I'd also like you to do this for me. So there's always that little bit of back and forth that I think sometimes we create conditions that motivate children to actually be successful. I mean, in a very concrete way, if you want your kid to do if your kid won't do a chore for you, then you're probably going to have to do the chore that they should have done, which means, do you really have time? I mean, it's very easy to turn to a kid and say, I just spent 15 minutes, walking the dog when that was your responsibility. So now you're asking me to drive you to her friends. That's going to take 15 minutes. No, you just ate up your 15 minutes of my time. If you walk the dog, I have the time to take you to your friends. Like, I don't want this to be punitive. I'm not going to deny you food or a bedtime story, but it's kind of like, I'd like you to make a contribution to make my life a little bit easier as well. And I don't think there's anything wrong with us kind of getting something that makes the child feel a little bit uncomfortable, right? I mean, yeah, so I guess I'm thinking, how can you make your child slightly uncomfortable so that being unmotivated and at home is not an easy decision? And now don't be surprised, by the way, if they sit in that discomfort for several weeks, but eventually that discomfort will wear thin for most kids anyways.
Thank you. So another question we have that came in is, how can high school teachers best support students who have suffered from mental illness during the pandemic? This is a big one.
Well, no, but that's a really great question. And if I might, the answer is kind of going back to some of the things that we've talked about. Teachers, I mean, obviously you're not going to do mental health therapy with a kid, and I don't suggest you do that actually, because I think what they need from their teachers is that predictability. If I might, they need things like routines. We know that even after tsunamis, after wildfires, the mental health intervention of choice by the Red Cross, the absolute mental health intervention of the Red Cross, the first thing that you do with a kid in a major disaster is get them back to school. You don't send them to psychologists, no offense, you don't send them to clinical social workers. You get them back into the routines of an educational environment that connects them to their peers, creates routines in their lives, reasonable expectations on them, and a sense of that their performance matters. So when I think of what teachers are offering structure and accountability and opportunities for growth and learning and relationship with an adult, and potentially in the classroom, opportunities for kids to connect with each other. Everything that is good pedagogy is all those good relationship things that teachers do is the mental health intervention. I think sometimes we think it's magical. It has to be a cognitive behavioral therapy with, Freud on the couch, and I'll freely associate about my childhood and whether or not I love my mother and everything. I mean, okay, that has a place, but for a very small percentage of people like Woody Allen or whatever, like, it's just, actually Woody Allen's a really bad example to use these days. But anyways, that sort of like, not everyone needs that intensive therapy. Now, I realize that my colleagues here are from the Huron-Perth Center. We would argue, of course, that there is a certain percentage of kids that need us, but that's not every child. A very small percentage of children are not going to respond to a teacher who creates a predictable, caring environment. Those children should seek a tertiary level or an extra bit of help. But most kids are going to need those sort of predictable environments that schools are so good at portraying. Safety, security. Give it a few weeks, a few months. By December, my prediction is that most kids will be back in balance because school will heal them just by showing up on a bus, eating your regular lunch, having some relationships, and having a teacher basically look at you very sternly and say, your homework is not done, and I expect better than that of you, right? That kind of stuff will help. And I'm not making it, by the way, it sounds trite, but actually that's what the research actually says. Kids have been through, we're not the first people to experience a crisis. Kids have been coming out of refugee camps in Jordan and Sierra Leone, and child soldiers have been demobilized, and wars have been fought in Cambodia. And we're not the first people to experience a major crisis with our kids. And kids do come back through that stuff, often because of the adults in their lives who create these environments for them.
Right. So right now that was all of the questions that we had lined up. So I will maybe just invite participants to, if you did have a pressing question or you were on the edge of your seat, not sure about asking, please go ahead. And then if you'd like, we can maybe look at some of those suggestions that parents did share while we waited to see if anybody else is going to add in a last question or two. Does that work on your end, Dr. Ungar?
Yeah, for sure. If you, even however you want to, absolutely happy to Yeah.
Perfect. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
And certainly I would be curious to see what the trend is in, if someone has read through some of the examples, what are some of the trends of how parents have managed to help their kids through the pandemic?
Yeah, so it looks like a lot of things like kind of routines, so simple routines, and then also things like chores, right? So helping with meal planning for throughout the week, or learning how to do laundry, or kind of adding to household chores. There's also been a few chats about shifting perspective. So really focusing on the positive, right? Seeing that silver lining, not only with, what can we be grateful about with the pandemic, right? What opportunities has it maybe offered us that it wouldn't have, but just kind of shifting our perspective based on specific situations, and doing also the rose and thorn activity, right? Where we're talking about the good of a day and then maybe also the thorny part of our days. We also had, encouraging kids to contribute to their community. So creating artwork to either be shared with nurses, frontline staff, or seniors in long-term care. So yeah, lots of really great stuff already.
Well, it's interesting because there are some studies that have come out during the pandemic of children. There was a study out of the US that came out that showed that children who had more routines in their families actually were less anxious and less depressed. So I know we sometimes focus on that, the mental health component, but children whose families created those routines and rituals and sort of expectations actually had children who showed lower levels of depression. I also love the themes about the contribution. I've often wondered, because I know I'm not sure how many of you have had that opportunity to order your groceries online here in Halifax for it's like a $3 surcharge, and you can have a whole, a week's order. And we've used that sometimes when the pandemic has flared. So we've used that so we can just do a drive-through pickup of our groceries. And I'm always amazed by families that are, you think, who's the most computer literate person in your home? And chances are it's not you, right? Chances are it's the person under the age of 14. And who most wants to eat in your home? And chances are that's not you either. It's probably the person under 14. So again, if you put those together, you begin to think about, well, why wouldn't you have your 13, 12-year-old do the shopping list for you? Here we are teaching them literacy online and the value of money, and they're probably going into some sort of educational think about all the learning that goes into. Do they have any idea? Do your kids actually know how much a loaf of bread is? A quart of milk? How to compare prices on pop and chips, and how to buy specials and figure out ratios? And if you buy that brand of flour, you're going to pay this much per unit gram or something. Think about all the learning that's right there, and think about all the time that you as a parent could just be sitting on the deck having a lovely drink, and while your kid is working in the kitchen figuring out and auditing all the groceries. Now, admittedly, they're probably going to end up with far more junk food than you'd ever want, but that is a small price to pay, I figure, in the end.
Part of that learning.
But the joke, it's about asking the child to step up and be a part of the family in a very concrete, realistic way, and that becomes what we've learned about what gets kids through these kinds of crises.
So we do have some questions now coming in. I think we'll have time for a few here. So the first one, I think that's really helpful, and probably a lot of parents are having right now, is what approach would you take with a child who is fearful or hesitant of re-entering the school environment or society in general?
Yeah, on this one, I really take a page from colleagues who specialize in anxiety disorders with children. And if it's a reactive anxiety, obviously this, a child who had a pre-existing condition of anxiety before the pandemic, this is not who I'm talking about, right? We're talking about a child who's developed that because of the isolation and the, just kind of gotten out of the groove here a little bit. I think what they're saying is basically encourage, just insist that the child go back into the environment. Do not accentuate it. Don't overly pander to it. It's a reasonable expectation that the child go back. Now, I am talking about not a child who has a severe diagnosed disorder in terms of anxiety. There's an extreme of this. that is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a child who's showing a sort of almost a normal level of anxiety to a major change in their routine. And to be fair, when a child goes from grade 6 to grade 7, or is it grade 7? What is it in Huron-Perth? Grade 7 to 8. Where's that transition year? Children will, their tummies will ache. They'll have diarrhea. They will somatize in many different ways. They'll feel sick and anxious. They'll regress in their behavior, just through that normative transition from one school year to the next when they have to change schools, right? So let's be real clear. This is normal for a child to experience this as a very stressful period. And all my colleagues seem to be saying that this is expected. And the best thing we can do is sort of set reasonable expectations with a little bit of love and a little bit of comfort, and acknowledge that when they do come home from that situation, to create a calmer environment. Maybe don't put them back into 12 activities in the fall. Maybe that's not a good idea. Maybe choose one that the child really wants to do and start the rest in January. But the coaching I'm getting from my colleagues in the field is saying returning the child to normal is actually the healing thing. Setting reasonable, don't over pander to what is a normal reaction, so the child gets this feeling that they're actually ill or disordered when all they are is experiencing a normal reaction to a difficult transition. There's a fine line to walk there. Obviously, the next question always is, and somebody asked it, at what point do I know my child is really struggling? And that then becomes, okay, now we see patterns like bedwetting, soiling, major temper tantrums, huge change in eating patterns that persist. And Val and Dana and I have some great clinicians on the line. If you want to add to the list of what to look for, I'm really open to you jumping in as well. But we're talking more severe sustained changes that are physiologically or behaviorally or emotionally really severe. So we're not talking about a couple of temper tantrums. We're talking like a complete change of personality on a child, severe changes in behaviors where it's really threatening to their health for a sustained period of time, more than say a few weeks. That's when I think professional help becomes maybe a little bit more in evidence. And I'm open to people, adding to that list or helping coach in terms of local wisdom.
Yeah, Mike, I think that resonates with me. And I also think it's important that if parents are worried about that sometimes can make it hard to know what's the best way to help. So certainly the center always would invite a call and an opportunity to think out loud about some of the things you're seeing. And we could chat with you about whether or not there's something that we could do or another local service could do to be helpful. So if someone's sitting in that place that they're not sure, there's a reach out. It can always be helpful to clarify that.
Lovely. Yeah.
So we have another question here. I think it's really relevant to what's been kind of going on in the last few weeks, kind of addressing those heavy conversations with our youth around the news and what's been going on. So the question is, in addition to the stress of the pandemic, we have seen a lot of tragedy of late, Indigenous communities, residential school situation, the murder of a Muslim family in London. How can we best address these events with our youth?
The thing I'm picking up again is a certain transparency or forthrightness about these issues, just to create an opportunity for kids to talk about this stuff in an age-appropriate way, of course, right? There seems to be something about naming the stressor as opposed to trying to avoid it. Again, in age-appropriate ways, but to engage. I mean, even to ask a child, have they heard about this? Did they have questions about it? Do they feel safe? What's their thoughts about it? Getting kids to comment on why they think it happens. Have they ever experienced anything like that? To make it personal. If they know a family, if they know another family that looks or seems to be experiencing something similar, what have they done? I mean, kids want to feel somewhat, they want to feel like a tragedy is close to them. Like they want to feel in control of something that's a little bit closer. So they want to take action. They want to make a donation. They want to do something that is tangible, in a sense, right? That's why, so I always defer to having somewhat honest conversations and asking kids about the things that might be troubling them, but also giving them maybe something concrete that they can actually do. That seems to be a bit of the formula with helping kids through these kinds of things, which is why, if you think about it, Greta Thunberg's movement of kids leaving school on Friday afternoons was so effective, because it took a very big, unruly issue that really bothers kids. Do I have a future? And there is a certain degree of anxiety and, in fact, hopelessness or apathy about the future based on the message about our climate emergency that we're experiencing. And Greta Thunberg gave them a message of, you can make a difference. You can contribute here by doing something very simple, like leaving school for an afternoon or whatever, right? Now, we might agree or disagree. I'm not really challenging that. What I'm saying is that it became the formula of saying to a kid, one, you can talk about this, but you can also do something rather than just becoming hopeless. And if you look through historically, that seems to be a bit the formula that prevents children from feeling that apathy or grating on them. And absolutely, by the way, that research we did in the States, one of the biggest stressors on kids in that teenage years was the fact of all the movements. We saw very clearly that in addition to the pandemic, kids were being affected by the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movements, the Indigenous rights movements, and the climate, the impending climate emergency, climate change. Now, I'm not saying that's bad that kids were stressed, but let's be honest, kids are picking it up and they are stressed by those things, and they're looking for ways to make the changes that matter.
So we have one last question here that I think kind of wraps things up nicely before we close off. And it is, how can we help kids and parents bring closure to their experiences with the pandemic?
Huh. That's a good one. I wonder what grief counselors would say about that moving along. I mean, part of it is going to be, most of us are going to have a collective amnesia. We're just going to move on. We're going to start traveling. We're going to go back into our regular routines, and we're going to sort of adapt to the new normal. But if you've had a more traumatic moment, it would be, I think people are going to want to integrate. I mean, for me, I think part of it is going to be about remembering what we learned and maybe adopting some of the positives. You know, what did we like about our family time together? And what didn't we like? But what did we like about our family time together? Making plans. A lot of families are making plans for the future, so that there's a sense of, you know, where are we going to travel, and engaging kids in that. What's our trip next year? Because we're going to be able to travel again. And how are we going to celebrate grandma's birthday in the year that comes? And, you know, so a bit of it's about moving on, and probably a bit of reflecting what we've learned, even if it is just simply saying the pandemic there were some good things about maybe our time together, or the fact that our dog really liked us more because we were at home, or so I do think it's about looking backwards at some of the positives and then looking forward to planning so that life, the new normal is there, and maybe keeping some of the things that we've already learned as part of our practices, so that going forward we don't lose those things. I think that's what's ultimately going to help us heal. Yeah, that's certainly from what I'm learning.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ungar. So I also wanted to say a big thank you to all of our participants and taking the time to share your responses and your questions. It really makes that rich experience for everybody, and your questions are often the questions that many others have as well. So you're giving voice to those who might not have had the chance or maybe the courage to ask. So I'll pass it on now to Katie to do our closing remarks.
Hi, Dr. Ungar. I'm a mental health therapist, that works at the Huron-Perth Center. So I've been really blessed and honored to attend this presentation and kind of do a little wrap up here. And a big thank you from the community. I've had the opportunity as well to be mentored one-on-one with Mike a few times, and I've really engaged well with the work. It's a new learning for me. As well as some of the community partners. And so I've seen a few of them on call today, and it warms my heart to kind of see us all come together and have a different way to look at our clients really that are coming in with some pretty complex mental health concerns. And instead of looking at the individual, we're able to bring in your work, Mike, and look at the context of the environment. And tonight was a really good example of different environmental concerns that have happened to kids and how they've been able to move through that. It was really optimistic and hopeful. So thank you so much for bringing that to the room again. I appreciate that. Also, a big thank you to the Huron-Perth Center, as well as the Huron-Perth Catholic District School Board and the Avon-Maitland District School Board for helping to put this together. It's appreciated.
Well, much appreciate this as well. I'll just simply say it's been wonderful working with as a mentor to many clinicians across the region, and I've learned a lot from your, engaging with all of you, and it's been very inspiring to see the amazing work. And so, encourage everyone listening tonight to, if you are struggling, don't hesitate with your family. There's some really amazing people working in these facilities and these across all your mental health services. I've had a chance to work and meet many of them, and it's inspiring. So all the best to you, and thanks again for the invitation here this evening.